All right, I think we're going to get started. Welcome, everyone. How's everybody doing?
Good. We can do better than that.
Come on. It's been a week. It's been a year. And, you know, I really struggled to think about how to welcome you all here today. For those of you I don't know, my name is Erin Graff Zivin. I'm professor of Spanish and Portuguese and comparative literature and director of the USC Dornsife Experimental Humanities Lab. I think I know everyone here. And, you know, all week, last week and a half, we've all been struggling a lot. A lot's going on campus. I'm actually so relieved to be in this beautiful space a few miles from campus, getting together on our own terms. I think that the Experimental Humanities Lab already is attempting to look for new spaces, whether it's when we're on campus, opening the doors wider and bringing new folks onto campus. Right now our campus is locked down. Literally, you can't come on campus if you're not affiliated with USC, and even if you are affiliated with USC, it's really hard to leave campus, right? So it's this very like physical, infrastructural image for me of exactly what we're trying to push against with the different projects we're doing in the Experimental Humanities Lab, and most especially pistemologies, thinking through rhythm, which I'll say a few words about in a minute. I first want to thank, we have many generous co-sponsors of today and tomorrow, the Kaufman School of Dance, the Dornsife Departments of Latin American and Iberian Cultures, Comparative Literature, our chair is here tonight, English and American Studies and Ethnicity, the Center for Latinx and Latin American Studies, and the Dornsife Graduate Dean and Divisional Vice Dean for the Humanities. They have all generously given to support today and tomorrow, so I'm very grateful. I wanted to thank Morgan and O'Brien from ArtShare, who've just been amazing in helping us put this together, as well as Monica and Melanie. If you don't know them, they work at AIR on campus, and they are really just incredible individuals who are so warm and generous and professional, and I'm very, very grateful for their help as well. I think we can all give Inger Flem Soto a round of applause. Inger is the graduate assistant who's been working with the lab this year and has created this beautiful program. If you don't follow us on Instagram, follow us just for Inger's beautiful work. It's really worth it. She also happens to be a brilliant scholar, which we can talk about later. But thank you, Inger. We could not have done this without you. This project, this initiative, has been in the works for quite a long time. It started as a series of conversations, one-on-one conversations. I remember a conversation you and I had. Maya, I remember a conversation that we had. Michael, I remember when I first saw your work and I hadn't met you yet. Mike Gallopay, I remember when we had, so there have been a lot of individual, kind of small group, one-on-one conversations where there's been this sense in which a lot of us who are interested in theory, philosophy, kind of conceptual work, and are very committed to creative practices, either through our own creative practices or because we study them, but are frustrated in which those objects of study remain objects of thought rather than producing thought. And really those of us who just want to be more creative with thinking more generally. So that's what's going on in the Experimental Humanities Lab, but that's also what has really motivated this initiative, which has had multiple parts. So the concept, or epistemology, which you'll hear about in detail tomorrow, is Michael J. Love's idea. He defines, of course, I did not print out the most important part. Oh my goodness. Okay, so You're going to hear all about Love's concept of epistemology tomorrow. But what we're interested in here is how knowledge itself emerges from rhythm, rhythmic practices, whether it's dance, whether it's music, whether it's other art forms. We can certainly talk about it in literary forms. We can talk about it in film. We can talk about the rhythm of thought. That's kind of the beating heart of this project that's taken on different forms. The people that you see at this table, whom I will introduce in a moment, and many of you in this room have participated in a study group this year. We've read each other's work, we've read our visitors' work in preparation for today, but also because we want to begin thinking through this problem and really just an exciting problem together. So we've had a study group. What was very cool about it, and you can each maybe say a little bit about it when you talk, is that it was the first time that on campus we sat, often in Edwin's beautiful backyard, which right now is a little bit, it's on campus, so it's a contested space. We sat in his backyard, we drank wine, we ate food, we talked about each other's work, but the people who were there came from, I think, 6 different colleges on campus, from the dance school, from the music school, from the School of Communication, from the film school, from Arts and Sciences, I think I'm missing one, and Roski, School of Art and Design. So I think 6 different schools were represented there. That really never happens. It certainly hasn't happened to me, and so I think we were all really grateful to be able to hear kind of what's going on and sort of what are the limits of our own thought and our own practice, and sort of exposing ourselves to that. So I'm very grateful for that experience. We are so excited to have with us today and tomorrow the people we've been reading and studying. Alex Chavez, who's right here. We can give a round of applause. Mike Gallopay, who's right here. Michael Love in the front row. Maya Kronfeld. And Michael Sawyer, whose flight is delayed but is arriving tonight. And then you'll hear from colleagues, students, postdocs, people in our community from USC who have been part of this project all year. Josh Kuhn, Kara Keeling, Jonathan Leal, Melandi Zandi is here, Jane Kassavin, Natalie Belisle, and Edwin Hill. So let me get to the important stuff, which is who are these wonderful people sitting next to me. Natalie Belisle, if you want to raise your hand, is assistant professor of Spanish and comparative literature at USC. Her research and teaching engage contemporary Caribbean literature, visual media, and cultural production. She is particularly interested in the relationship between aesthetics and political practice, racial mobilities in Latin America, political philosophy, and theories of existence in phenomenology and speculative fiction. Belisle's book, Caribbean in Hospitality, The Poetics of Strangers at Home, is forthcoming with Rutgers University Press at the end of this year. And it's brilliant, and you should all buy it as soon as it comes out. Engaging contemporary literature, visual and digital media, and theory from the Spanish, Anglophone, and the Francophone Caribbean. The book charts the historic, economic, and discursive transformation of the Caribbean as a space that is hospitable to foreigners, and argues that this idea of Caribbean hospitality not only informs the articulation of regional and national sovereignty, but also delimits the idea of citizenship and rights available to citizens of Caribbean nations. Belisle is developing a second book project tentatively titled The Opacity of Belief, The Other Worlds of Caribbean Speculation. Edwin Hill, 2 down from me, is associate professor in the Department of French and Italian and the Department of American Studies and Ethnicity, and a faculty fellow in the USC Society of the Humanities. His first book, Black Soundscapes, White Stages, from 2013, builds a conceptualization of sound as a terrain of post-colonial conquest and contestation where one's place in the world is critically imagined and experienced. Hill's current book in progress, entitled Black Static and the French Republic of Sound, deals with sound culture and the politics of race and emotion in contemporary France. Hill's scholarship appears most recently in the edited volumes Sound Senses, The New Modernist Studies, and Transpositions, Migration, Translation, Music. Hill is also the creator, host, and executive producer of Dance Hubs, an audio docu-series about street dance and spaces of creative movement. Jane Kassavin is a doctoral candidate in comparative studies in literature and culture at USC, specializing in Latin American literature and sound studies. On Monday, she will defend her dissertation, Vital Sounds, Unsettling Voice in Latin America, which analyzes dissident practices of vocality and voicing in modern and contemporary Brazilian, Argentine, and Chilean poetry, and has been funded through the Fulbright Hayes Doctoral Dissertation Abroad Research Grant. Her writing has already been published or is forthcoming in the Journal of Latin American Cultural Studies, the Latin American Literary Review, and Comparative Literature. So she has been busy. Go out and read her as soon as you get the chance. And last but certainly not least, Jonathan Leal, Assistant Professor of English at USC. Leal is a Latino author, composer, and interdisciplinary theorist who studies the long echoes of colonial encounter. Born and raised in the South Texas border region known as the Rio Grande Valley, RGV, I now know. I didn't know before, RGV. Leal works as an artist scholar to create research projects focused on borders and empire, place and belonging, technology and aesthetics, and creative and political practices. Leal's recent creative work has included sound and music design for Cherie Moraga's The Mathematics of Love, a collaborative compilation album, Wild Tongue, featuring music by 9 Latinx bands from the South Texas borderlands, a collaborative speculative transmedia cast album entitled Future Conjunto, a 6-part jazz suite exploring post-utopian sentiment entitled After Now, as well as several singles and collaboratively composed musical compositions. Leal is the author of Dreams in Double Time on Race, Freedom, and Bebop, which was published last year by Duke University Press, and the co-editor of Cyber Media, Explorations in Science, Sound, and Vision. He is currently at work on 2 new book projects on music, cultural memory, and the contemporary US-Mexico borderlands, the first of which is entitled Wild Tongue, a Borderlands mixtape, under contract with Duke University Press. And I just want to say that Jonathan has really been such a brilliant soul and creative inspiration for really all of the parts of this initiative. We co-organized a seminar at the American Comparative Literature Association meeting this year. Natalie was a part of it, Maya was a part of it, Michael was a part of it, around Michael's concept of epistemology. And it's just been really, really inspiring to learn from him. I've asked him already to be my mentor, even though he is my junior colleague. And did you agree?
I think that's still up in the air.
Oh, darn it. Okay, so I'll have to convince you. So please join me in welcoming these wonderful creators and thinkers who are going to share a few words with you tonight.
We're a small group too, so if you need me to speak up, just let me know. Hi everybody, it's so great to see you. Thank you for braving the traffic and being here, inside on such a lovely sunny afternoon. So I was thinking, after Erin's introduction and thinking about this as kind of part of the introductory sequence of events for this 2-day series, that maybe I could just read part of the initial description for what was the ACLA seminar, right? But is also threaded through what this two-day event is, and it's rhythm, right? So as a category, rhythm names a kind of sensory interface with the world, an entry point into temporal unfolding across scales. So we're not even in the realm of the arts at this point, right? The rapid revolutions of electrons around nuclei. Any scientists in the room? Aspirationally, maybe? The immeasurably slow deaths of distant galaxies, the ebb and flow of human breathing, the seasonal migrations of birds, the steady build of a tropical storm. Rhythm implies cyclicalities, departures and returns, dramatic interconnections of bodies and systems. And artists who focus attention on rhythm, be those people musicians, dancers, poets, filmmakers, and more, do so in ways that can draw receivers' attention back to their own bodies, their own senses, and their own perceptions of movement, change, and event boundaries. And so the question is why? Why think about rhythm in this way? Especially, with this group of people, as Erin was saying, all of us are variously committed to artistic praxes and, the academic praxes, that are more readily recognized by the Academy as it stands today. In other words, how do we connect the kinds of knowledge that we make through rhythm to the kinds of knowledge that are most easily digested by the contemporary academy? So to think and make through rhythm, to develop concepts through it, there's an implicit connection here to language, right, or symbolic systems, is to fundamentally unsettle many of the philosophical inheritances of the imperial West, the atomized individual thinking subject divorced from dependency or human relation, right? The idea that the individual possesses everything, right? The epistemology of the 0 point, a thinking that emerges miraculously somehow, without geographic or embodied context, right? The myth of objective knowledge. Even and especially conceptions of the human that presume a universal subject devoid of locational or experiential specificity, or more accurately, that implicitly demand accordance to a colonialist hierarchy that measures humanness by way of proximity to an arbitrary ideal, right? We can see this in the work of Sylvia Wynter, Hortense Spillers, Vijay Iyer, Fred Moten, and certainly all of the people who are going to be sharing work with us here these next 2 days. So with that in mind, the concepts that can emerge from a focus on rhythm promise engagements with people, environments, and their attendant histories, promise concepts that can defamiliarize and unsettle, if for no other reason than that they openly emerge from sensory experience, from our bodies and from those bodies being in motion. Now, I join a lot of people, and especially Vijay Iyer, in my sort of personal vendetta against nouns. And there's a good reason for this. I mean, categorically speaking, I grew up near a border. I don't like borders. I understand that categories and linguistic expressions that rely on nouns, that they provide us useful information. We need them. We can't operate without them. But if we fixate on them, I think we, and this has been said by a lot of people before me, I think we lose a lot of the action that is in the world, literal action, right? I think it was Baudrillard who once called the verb as the angel of motion. And so I like to think about what it means to create knowledge through verbs. And a word like rhythm, even though it is a noun, forces our attention to process, to change, to unfolding developments. And so if rhythm can offer us anything in terms of us as writers, us as theorists, I think it is an attention, an attenuation to process, right? To process at different scales, be barely perceptible, be not perceptible at all given our human forms, or the hardly imaginable when we're thinking about the grandest scales imaginable, right? So in terms of what this group has offered me personally, I am a person who is a musician, as Erin was saying. I have always been looking for spaces on campuses to share in the kind of unruly knowledge making that feels intuitive to a lot of us. And I'm grateful to this group at USC and beyond for what it has been able to provide, both psychically and intellectually, amid a very tumultuous time especially. So with all that, I will stop yapping and thank you all again for being here.
microphone close to you.
Oh, sure. Well, thank you all for being here and for listening to me. I have something short written because it is a little easier for me to express myself this way. And I want to talk a little bit about, in my own work, and the question, what rhythm means to me in this group in my own work. So, in my own work, I came to the question of rhythm largely through poetry, where meter, rhyming, caesura, and other formal elements define not only the rhythmic structure of a poem in writing, but give shape to the way in which it is spoken as well, modulating the rhythms of breathing, pausing, and beginning again. My dissertation, entitled Vital Sounds, Unsettling Voice in Latin America, examines the voice as a point of creative and theoretical fissure. With regards to voices and vocalities we consider properly legible or intelligible both politically and aesthetically. To say that the voice is both an index of political subjectivity and aesthetic and rhetorical singularity is a well-known cliché, though beneath this notion of vocality is the assumption that these voices may be audible, intelligible, or understandable from within dominant frameworks and binaries of silence and sound, speech and noise, and sound and language. I recently decided to begin my dissertation, which is getting defended very soon, with a quote from one of Brazil's most well-known indigenous philosophers, Alton Krenak, and the quote is, "Let us listen to the voices of rivers, for they speak." For this philosopher, listening to rivers is not so much a vague ethical metaphor, but rather a shifting of the limits of community and relation configured through a listening that alters the fabric of sensation and intelligibility. And I quote here, "At night the river's waters run swiftly and murmurously, and their whispers travel down the rocks to form rapids that make music. At the time, the rock and the water are so wonderfully entangled with us that we can say, we river, we mountains, and we earth." Which led me to think, in conversation with this group, if the notion of music from this purview of indigenous Krenaki philosophy overflows or questions the very category of riverine sound, what are we to make of its rhythms or what we hear in its ebbs and flows? Though Krenaki is not necessarily a poet, part of what fascinates me about his work and much of the Black and indigenous poetics from Brazil, Argentina, and Chile that I look at is the way in which such rhythms are not only studied or heard as object, but rather infiltrate into language and writing in order to reconfigure the limits of what can be said. I came to this idea very early on, and I've been thinking about this a lot recently in reading one of my favorite essays from the poet and theorist Nathaniel Mackey, an essay entitled Cante Moro. In an extended meditation on the notion of duende and flamenco and the work of the Andalusian poet Federico Garcia Lorca, Mackey draws a comparison to forms of Black creative expression that straddle the limits of speech and music, and poetry and song, extending the voice beyond itself. The following quote has recurred in my meditations departing from, and with many of the poets I think with and work on. Quote, "Everyone talks about the speech-like qualities of instruments as they're played in African-American music. Built into that is some kind of dissatisfaction with, if not critique of, the limits of conventionally articulate speech and verbal speech. One of the reasons the music so often goes over into non-speech is to say, among other things, that the realm of conventionally articulate speech is not sufficient for saying what needs to be said. We're often making that same assertion in poetry." For Mackey, this pursuit of another voice, or voices that conflict and overtake one another, is what creates often unruly, cacophonous sound, or a multiply aspect of vocality that scrambles the limits of speech. This is not only to speak multiply, but to multiply speak, in rhythms that perhaps interrupt or overflow the ones that we have become accustomed to, and fall somewhere offbeat in resonant forms of caesura and syncopation. My attunement to what this implies and the implications of speaking multiply, or to speak in forms and expressions that fall outside of conventional political and aesthetic modes of speech, emerges from an inquiry into what is lost or eluded in the voices tethering to notions of subjectivity, citizenship, humanness, and political and aesthetic agency along racial and colonial lines. This is a long inquiry that has led me to many Black and indigenous philosophies of vocality in Latin America, not in order to argue that they are the same, but to rather consider how they expand or disrupt the normative category of voice in order to bring it somewhere beyond or outside of itself, upsetting notions of subjectivity and its attendant rhetorical forms through dissonant shouts and unsound whispers and silences. One place where I've examined this recently, and in conversation with many of the people here in the audience, is in contemporary Mapuche poetics from the states currently known as Argentina and Chile. The formal technique of the caesura often creates a pause or an inhalation in verse poetry, a line break separating speech from silence, words from the inhalations that punctuate them. For the indigenous poets I work with, caesuras also become sudden cuts or enjambments that interrupt the rhythms of language and poetry in order to rearrange the limits between silence and sound, and presence and absence, undoing both writing and speaking in normative modes, and in this case Spanish itself, through the vengeance of those who have been silenced or unheard by legacies of settler colonialism. I'm inspired to think about how experiments with poetic rhythm, as well as the limits between sung and spoken vocality, produce and upend forms of knowledge, even what we're calling pistemologies, somewhere between the voice and writing, and in the inextricability of those two.
Y'all, I thought we were going to do informal remarks.
I know, I'm like,
I'm up here,
sorry.
notepad, no. Oh my gosh.
I asked if I could write it down, and the answer was yes.
No, thank
improvisation is one of the things
improvisation.
that-
Yeah, that's something we can talk about too, improvisation. Thank you for organizing this amazing event. Thank you everyone for coming in these stressful times and very busy times. And it's really exciting to open this conversation on a topic that really would fall into the margins somehow or slip through the cracks in a lot of ways. And yeah, it's been really incredible over the course of the year to meet colleagues who are thinking expansively about rhythm, sound, and music, and thinking about it in so many different ways. And you know, where rhythm becomes kind of like a vector for intellectual encounter and engagement and discussion that's also taken place, as you mentioned, in a really informal, comfortable way. So it's kind of created the context for different kind of, vulnerabilities, and in terms of, sort of like experimenting with ideas or just having open questions that you don't have the answer to. And on the one hand, I feel like it's invited us to think about what rhythm is. And some of the opening remarks that you made definitely talked about that in terms of, the different spatialities. We start talking about rhythm, and suddenly we're talking about space, right? We're talking about cycles. We're also maybe talking about patterns, right? And so rhythm becomes in this way a kind of organizing principle for thinking about spatialities as well as temporalities, right? And within a rhythm, there's never just one rhythm also, right? Just like there's never one note. Any note is actually an infinite number of notes, right? So maybe with any rhythm, you have many different textures or feelings or tensions or ways of cognitively registering a rhythm. It's really interesting to, have those moments where you were hearing a rhythm one way and then other things come in and suddenly you're kind of dizzy for a second as you try to figure out where it is, but also how different people experience or express rhythm in different ways that are all legitimate at the same time, So it's also thinking, in that way about possibilities, that exist already within the present. For me, for my work, I was thinking about this opening dialogue, and I was thinking about what it would mean to do an autobiography of yourself through rhythm. What it would mean. What is your rhythm biography? Maybe that's another autobiography. No, it doesn't work. And so for me, much like my friend, Professor Leal, I studied music growing up and did an undergraduate degree in music. And so music has always been for me a kind of way of understanding myself and understanding the world and understanding my body. It's kind of, engendered practices of tapping and, turning your mouth into a percussive instrument or repeating percussive refrains with different parts of your body. So registering the world through rhythms and counts and kind of like, and registering the world in a way that, I think that just as, when we're thinking about rhythm and knowledge, we're asking what is rhythm, we're also asking what is knowledge. We're kind of reconceptualizing knowledge. So a lot of times I'm thinking about, how rhythm is registered. Maybe knowledge is not the right word, right, for something that is definitely related to knowing somehow, but that where, knowing isn't, one of the things we could ask is where is rhythm taking place and where is thought taking place when we think rhythm or think through rhythm. So it engages our body in a lot of different ways. For me in my research, that's really made me think about, when I'm thinking about, patterns and spatialities and temporalities and, the polyrhythmic nature of sort of being, It makes me think of, the roots and the branches and entanglements of diaspora, entanglements with modernity and with urban experience. As a French scholar, I'm particularly interested in the post-war years, but also the contemporary moment. And so, it makes me think about, for example, also, different scales of diaspora. What does it mean when we start to think about diaspora as something that's not just taking place over long distances, but that's taking place in short distances, So what does it mean, for example, in my research, I'm thinking about walking, and, so what I think of as the pedestrian practices of diaspora, and navigating urban terrains is also a diasporic practice, right, that therefore gives on to a different kind of theory of diaspora, because it's tapping into different scales and patterns and rhythms of movement through the city and its engagement with the infrastructures of the city, what it means to, for example, right now, to walk while Black faculty on campus at USC, right? How am I perceived as belonging or not belonging to a certain space? What sort of patterns of movement does it engender? And then also, what kind of sort of affective or emotional maps get sort of imagined when we're thinking about these patterns and rhythms of movement in urban terrains? So, and also it makes me think about vernacular culture a lot, as Jane, thinks about in her work. I think a lot about, I have thought a lot about, poetry and sort of poetics and rhythms of vernacular speech, and how those rhythms sort of carry with them the gestures and histories and experiences of diaspora. So they're kind of reservoirs for experiences and ways of understanding and being in the world that are, sort of dealing with histories of, experiences of Black containment, and sort of, so those are some of the things that I'm thinking about when I'm thinking about rhythm, but I'm really excited to engage more with all of your work and to hear more what you're thinking about in terms of rhythm and knowledge.
I think I can. Thank you. Yeah, thank you, everyone. It's great to be here. So, I had a conversation with Erin about this even before this project began, about the fact that, in academia, many of us are artists or movement practitioners. Movement is my thing. And how there's a sort of divorce, right, between the intellectual labor, what we consider the intellectual labor, and the creative practice. And I felt that was very much the case with me as someone who is an amateur dancer, also trained in classical piano as a child and teenager, a yoga practitioner for a little over a decade. So someone for whom movement is very much part of my personal life, part of my own healing practice, and yet something that I've contained and separated from my quote-unquote intellectual practice. And I guess as I was ending the first book, that divorce, right, I started thinking about how I could merge those parts of myself that I felt I had split. And so that's how I came to this project as someone who works with literary texts, very traditional, the novel, mostly the novel, some poetry, as a scholar of the Caribbean, a region that is known for movement and specifically for its music. So I wanted to reorient pedagogically in my classroom, but also in my research, how we approach texts from a region that is known for movement, for rhythm, for music. Antonio Benitez Rojo, whose foundational, although problematic book, The Repeating Island, describes the Caribbean as a rhythmic area, and specifically as a polyrhythmic area. So rhythms intersecting other rhythms. And he invites us to approach the Caribbean through that theory of polyrhythm. So I wanted to think about, I taught a class now twice, but the first time I taught it, called The Movement of the Caribbean and the Movement of Caribbean Literature. So how can we approach the Caribbean literature through the body in a way that goes beyond the containment of reading? And I wanted to think of the body, and very much directed by Susan Lee Foster, not just as a text, right, or as an object of study, but as something that actually writes, right? So as writing itself, or even an instrument of writing. And so in this class that I taught, again, this semester, I had students, it was very uncomfortable for them and for me a bit, change the way we actually read texts, especially texts that have to do with dance and movement. Very well-known canonical literary works, from poems to novels. For example, in one instance, there's a poem that's called Majestad Negra by a very well-known Puerto Rican poet that describes the procession of a queen, an African queen, and it interfaces that procession with the experience of working on the plantation. So how do we read a text with our bodies? How do we think through a text with our bodies that has to do with a sort of carnivalesque procession that's also a metaphor for the experience of the plantation? And so we actually, I actually had my students engage in the reading of the poem through a processional act. And it actually changed the way they perceived and read the poem. So part of, I guess, long story short, part of my process has been to disrupt our pedagogies of reading, the reading practices that we've internalized and learned from childhood to now, with regards to texts that have to do with movement, dance, but also diasporic movement, as you said, movement across borders, not only long patterns of movement, of transnational movement, historic movement, such as the experience of the transatlantic slave trade, but also more recent diasporic and post-colonial movement. So how can we bring that into our understanding of the text? And the project that another project that I'm working on, which I presented at the American Comparative Literature Association conference, has to do with how we read the opacity of blackness within text. And this project that I'm working on is taking one of the most important instruments in a salsa band, which is the clave. It's a wooden stick that basically holds the beat. But it goes silent after a certain point. I mean, it's playing, but the other sounds in the band kind of overtake that sound. So you don't really hear it that much, especially if you're dancing. And I wanted to think about the clave in relation to the disappearance of blackness, and specifically anti-blackness, within dance spaces, Latin dance spaces. So what does it mean to contend with something, blackness, that's holding the rhythm of a text, and at the same time that disappears within the text, socially, politically, and culturally? So that's my project, and I'm really excited to be part of this group of scholars. Just in closing, one of the things that I loved about our reading group was because writing about this is very new to me, even though the practice itself is not. And I really enjoyed reading Jonathan's scholarship, Edwin's work, just the actual method, right? How do you write about this in a way that disrupts, again, pedagogies of reading, pedagogies of the way you learn to do research, the way you write about scholarly research, especially as a literary scholar. So I really enjoyed that aspect of our reading group. And so I hope we can learn different methods of doing scholarship through rhythm in the next 2 days. Thank you.
Great. So now you can see how amazing this year has been, because I get to coexist with these wonderful wonderfully creative, generous thinkers. So I want to talk a bit about, this is very awkward, I want to talk a bit about what the rest of today and tomorrow will look like. This is probably the only session where we won't have time for discussion and debate and really getting into it with each other, because we're really excited to hear Alex Chavez's music. We're very fortunate to have him here with us tonight. But every other session has built within it ample time for discussion, if everyone sticks to their time. So please come with questions, come with interventions, disagreements, inspiration, ideas. What did you walk in here hoping to find? What are the things that are keeping you up at night, right? What are the things you're struggling with in your own creative work or research? But really the idea is to bring you all into this conversation. It's not supposed to be, despite sort of the limitations of a room where there's kind of a stage and a public, we're trying to kind of round things out so that we will look at each other and really be able to listen to one another together. So thank you for sharing your thoughts. And now I'm happy to introduce, once again, Jonathan Leal, who will introduce our very special guest tonight, Alex Chavez, and we'll be moving these tables away for the next session.